this goes. I see a line of cars and they are painted black, with flowers and my love both never to.
Ready.
In February of 1969, I was working on a farm, and I received, my boss came and told me to go up to the store, the little local grocery store where my mother was working, and I kind of balked a little bit, and he goes, no, it's important, you need to go. So all right, so I went up to the store, and as soon as I walked in, my mother saw me, she started crying. So I kind of knew it was something. So she handed me my letter from the Selective Service, and I was being drafted into the military. And so that evening at the dinner table with my dad and my brother and my mom, my dad said, I got a piece of advice I'd like to give you. I know you're 19 years old and you can make your own decisions, but he said, I was in the jungles in the Philippines during World War II, and he says, I know what it's like to be a ground pounder in the jungles. So he said, I suggest, and my recommendation is that you go talk to the recruiters and see if you can sign up for the extra year and get into something that you would enjoy doing. And so the next day I went to town. We lived out in the country. I drove to town and I went to the local post office. That's where all the recruiters were, upstairs of the post office. And I talked to the Navy, I talked to the Air Force. They already had their allotment of people and weren't going to be bringing anyone in for a couple months, and I didn't have that kind of time to wait. So I went to the Army recruiter and talked with him. A good guy, he was an E6, and I took a test for him and I scored exceptionally high in mechanics. So he says, I have two areas that I can offer you. One is working on trucks and the other is aviation. And he said, now I recommend aviation because rank comes quickly, and with rank comes additional pay and less hassles. So anyway, long story short, I signed up that day to go into the Army. I went in on the delay program at that time, and I was going to go into aviation. After boot camp at Monterey, California, Fort Ord, I was sent to Fort Rucker, Alabama, and we landed in Mobile, Alabama in the middle of the night, and again stepped out of the plane, and it was 100 degrees, 90% humidity, and it was almost as if someone had stuck your head into a fishbowl and told you to breathe. It just take your breath away.
Kiss me goodbye and write me while I'm gone. Goodbye, my sweetheart. Hello, Vietnam. America has heard the bugle.
Tell me about the moment you stepped off the plane and into Vietnam.
Okay, landed at Ton Son Nhut and stepped out of the plane, and immediately the heat hits you. It's like 110 degrees, and the humidity is 90%. But the thing that really hits you the hardest is the smell. If you know what a outhouse smells like on an August day in the South, that's exactly what Vietnam smelled like. It smelled like an outhouse, a hot outhouse, and it would actually take your breath away for a moment because it stunk so bad. Helicopters would come into the hangars after 100 flying hours for a complete go-over. All the panels would come off, all the inspection panels would come off the aircraft, and then it would be thoroughly inspected from nose to tail, and any deficiencies that were found.
What helicopters did you take care of there? C models, H models, D models?
We had two different ones. We had UH-1Hs, which was the troop carrier and supply carrier, and then we had UH-1Cs, who were they were the gunships. They were the ones that provided gun cover and security for the H models when they would go on combat assault missions and taking guys out into the woods and dropping them off, or going out and picking them up and bringing them back in. Those were the two aircraft that was in my unit.
How long did you work as a mechanic before you transitioned onto guns?
I worked about 6 or 7 months in the hangar, and then one day a friend of mine that I had met over there, who was actually from across the valley from where I lived, he and I were very good friends. His name is Michael Chacon, and Mike was a crew chief, and his gunner had to go do a physical, so Mike asked me if I would fly as his gunner that day. Well, I had never flew as a gunner before, and so I got the opportunity to fly that day, and I got to see the South China Sea, and I got to go to several fire bases out on mountaintops. And I'll just say this, I took it hook, line, and sinker. I knew that from that moment, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly.
Some folks are born made to wave the flag. Ooh, they're red, white, and blue. And when the band plays hail to the chief, ooh, they point the cannon at you. No, it ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no senator, son. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate born. No. Some folks are born silver spoon in hand. Lord, don't they help themselves, dawg? But when the tax man comes through the door, Lord, the house looking like a rummage sale, yes. It ain't me.
We usually would get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and usually go over and have something to eat at the mess hall. Then we would go out to the flight line, my gunner and I. The armament guys would have already armed everything. The miniguns were already armed and ready to go. The rockets would already be in the rocket pods and ready to go. And I would usually do my own personal pre-flight of the aircraft and make sure everything is up to snuff and ready to go before the pilots would get there. And we had our 60s, and if we needed to do anything with them before the day began, we would do that, my gunner and I. And then we always fueled the aircraft at the end of the previous day, so it was already fueled up and ready to go. So the pilots then would show up, and they would do their pre-flight, and if they found anything they didn't like, they would ask me about it, and I would usually explain to them what it's all about. And then they already had the mission planned for the day, and sometimes we would talk about the mission plan, what we were expected to do and what to expect and so forth. And then once everybody was settled in, pilots were strapped in, untie the main rotor blade, crank up, and go to work. So we would fly out usually to the location. Sometimes we would go to like a fire base and sit down, and then the pilots would all get together along with the if it was like the 4th Infantry or something like that, their people, they would all get together and hash out how they're going to do this particular assault. And then they would come, once they got that all figured out, then they would come back out to the aircraft, and we would crank up and go to the area that we were going to work in. And when we got it, we would usually be the first ones there, and we would fly around and try to draw fire. We'd fly real low, try to draw some fire, try to see somebody in the tree line, look for any obstacles or anything would be in the way to let the slicks know. And then usually the slicks would roll in just shortly after that, and we'd start laying down gunfire in the tree lines. And if there's anybody there, try to make them put their heads down so the slicks could come in. Sometimes the slicks would come in as a unit. There might be 6 or 8 of them, and they would all sit down in the LZ together at one time and dump the grunts off. Or sometimes if the LZ was real small, they would have to come in one at a time and drop their people off. And but the whole time we would be flying 180 degrees out from each other, the 2 gunships, and we would be flying in a circle around the LZ. And that's how we provided gun cover for the slicks to be able to come into the LZ and dump whatever it was they were hauling, usually guys. If not, if it wasn't a supply run, sometimes we had gun cover for supply runs as well. But
how long would you guys stick around after the slicks took off to give cover to the soldiers that just got dropped off?
Until they told us everything was secure. Yeah, usually 30 minutes after the slicks had dropped everybody off, it was either a secured or it was a hot LZ, and so the guy on the ground would tell us. But if the LZ was secure and everything was okay, then we would break, and we'd usually just go and fuel and rearm, and sometimes we would go back out and be there a while longer, and then sometimes we would just be on standby, and we would just be right there ready to go. If they needed us, we were able to crank and get out there right away. And we started to lift off, and we just got centrifugal lift and was starting to climb out, and the bleed band actuator on our turbine engine popped open, malfunctioned, which means all the RPMs just bled off, and we just came down with a big thump. Fortunately, we weren't that high off the ground, so it didn't spread the skids or anything from the weight, but we had a pretty hard landing, and so it was an engine failure on takeoff.
And you landed in a rice paddy?
No, we landed next to the rice paddy in a ditch full of water.
What happened to the helicopter after?
Well, they eventually brought a Chinook out, and they hooked up the recovery guys. There was a group of guys that work in the hangar. They're on the recovery team. So the recovery team came out and hooked up all the rigging, and they brought a Chinook in, and they hooked the cords and stuff to the Chinook, and the Chinook then my helicopter had sank into this muck, and the Chinook was pulling up on it, and you could literally hear their engines bleeding off because this thing wouldn't move. It was just, and finally, after a couple of 3 or 4 good tugs, it went boom. It just popped out of the water like a cork, And of course the Chinook went up because he was pulling in power. But anyway, and then the Chinook took it back to our base camp, and they brought out a water truck, and the engine guys from the hangar brought another engine. And that night I took all the inspection panels off, took a big water hose and just washed everything down in the helicopter. And at the same time, the engine guys replaced the engine, and they ran it up, the new engine up, to make sure everything was okay. And I washed everything out, and I helped the armament guys. They came out, and we rearmed everything. They cleaned the miniguns for me. They took the miniguns apart because they were full of mud and water. They took my miniguns apart for me and cleaned everything up and reinstalled them. They cleaned my rocket pods up for me because they were full of mud. They cleaned everything up for me and rearmed everything. And next morning we went flying, just like nothing happened. This is really funny. When I was working in maintenance, they had an opening on the day crew, and so they would always give the guys on the night crew the opportunity to move from nights to days. Well, I was one of the guys, I was one of 3 that was picked to have the opportunity to go from nights to days. Well, I didn't want to go to days. I wanted the night shift, because if our area ever got hit or anything like that, it was always at night, between midnight and 3 or 4 in the morning. So I liked working nights in the hangar because that meant I was awake, and I didn't have to wake up out of a dead sleep and figure out what was going on. So that particular evening, the maintenance sergeant come over and he goes, Fred, I want you to put the tail rotor back on this helicopter. And I said, okay. So I went to we had different departments in the hangar, and one of them was a tail rotor section. And the guys would take the tail rotors and go through them, go through the hubs and everything during maintenance. So I went and got the tail rotor, came out. Well, normally it would only take me about 2 hours, 2.5 hours to install one, get it inspected and get it passed and everything. Well, this particular evening it took me 8 hours. And so at the end of the shift, my maintenance sergeant come over to me and he goes, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Nothing." He goes, "Well, I know you're quicker than this. What happened?" And I told him, "Sarge, I don't want to go to days. I want to stay on nights." So anyway, one of the other guys went to days. So at the end of the shift, that particular aircraft was pushed out of the hangar that night, and it was put on flight line for the next day. So I was in the barracks, and I was asleep, and this guy come in and he woke me up and he goes, "Hey, did you put that tail rotor on number 123 this last night?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, the tail rotor came off." And I said, "There's no way the tail rotor came off." "Yeah, tail rotor came off. The tail rotor came off and they crashed over on the runway." And I went, "You're out of your mind. There's no way." And he goes, "Yeah." So in my mind, I was going over every nut, bolt, Carter key, safety wire, you name it. And I'm going, "There's no way." So I got up and got dressed, walked all the way over to the hangar, and walked in, and the maintenance sergeant for the day crew was there. And I asked him, I said, "Hey, I heard 123 lost the tail rotor." And he goes, "No." He said, "What happened was, when we would get a new group of pilots in, they had to do a thing called a check ride. And one of the things they had to do during the check ride was they had to demonstrate that they could auto-rotate. Well, when you auto-rotate, the aircraft comes down, and then they flare, which means they tuck the tail, and then they're supposed to rock up and then gently set it down. It's a means by which you could safely land the aircraft without engine power." Okay. Well, one of the little Peter P's, as we used to call them, was doing an auto rotation, and when he tucked the tail, he tucked it too hard, and not with enough room, and he stuck the tail rotor into a PSP runway. And of course, it tore the tail rotor off, it tore the gearbox off, and yeah, they went down. But it had nothing to do with me, you know. And so
You just took the blame.
no, I didn't even take the blame. I looked for the guy who come and woke me up and told me that, and I never saw that guy again. I don't know who he was. I don't know where he was, but I never found. But I went looking for him because I didn't appreciate that at all.
Curious, what are these for?
They're antennas.
Those are antennas.
Yep.
Okay.
For a radio. You have several different radios in there. You have within an intercom within that the 4 people can talk. Then you have an FM, which the FM usually was for the guys on the ground, so the pilots could talk to the guys on the ground. There was an AM, which usually was used with if you had a flight of aircraft. The pilots talked amongst themselves. Okay. Then you had a regular radio, so you could listen to music. Believe it or not.
What was your favorite station in Vietnam?
There was only one, Armed Forces Radio. That was it.
And what would you? And coming up to these,
Okay.
How did these change your flight characteristics, and how did these work?
Well, they control the tail boom, the pitch of the tail boom, and they're called elevators.
Okay.
That's what they're called.
And were they automatic? So as when you pitched down the helicopter, or was it something that manually the pilot would have to do?
It was part of the manual system that they had to move something to move them, and during flight, majority of the time they just stayed level because you didn't do any aerobatics with it or anything like that. But they did move, and their purpose was to control the tail boom.
How well would these hold up getting shot?
Well, it's hollow inside.
Well, how well would they?
Most of the time, you could just put a patch over it. We had a guy in our maintenance group. He was called a machinist, and he would spend a lot of nights sitting on a bench or on a little table, and all he did was put patches over bullet holes all night long, and so that it could go out and fly the next day.
So the drive line that runs from the back of the engine back here, if it took a round from, say, an AK-47, it held up pretty well?
Sometimes. It just depends on where it hits it. I've seen them hit and ricochet off, and it put a dent in it, and they might have a little vibration, and they'd go on and fly. Then I've seen them where they take a round and they would disintegrate.
Okay, can you tell me about this engine?
It's a Lycoming engine built by Lycoming Company. This particular one, I believe, is an L13. The ones that we had on the C models were L11s. These had more horsepower than the ones we had on the C models, but they're basically the same engine, just this one was built with more horsepower than the other. They're rugged engines, very rugged engines. I've seen these engines shot up and still run, and you'd swear it would come apart, but it didn't. They were pretty rugged, and they were workhorses.
Tell me about whenever you guys would stop for lunch, and you said you had an asbestos glove or something. Okay, and you tell us what you did and show us.
Well, I had an asbestos glove. I don't know where I got the thing. I wound up with it, and we ate sea rations, and some of them sea rations, when they were cold, they were terrible. So what I did, when we would land, the pilots would have to turn the engine to an idle and let it run for a little bit and let it cool down, and then they would shut it off. Well, during that cool down period, I would grab everybody's main meal and poke a hole in the top of the can, and I would come back here to the tailpipe, and I would, with the asbestos glove, I would set a couple of cans right on the edge of the tailpipe, and after just a couple of seconds, turn the can, and then a couple of seconds, less than a minute, way less than a minute, take the cans off, open them up, and whatever was inside would be bubbling. So we'd have a hot meal. So I would do everybody's main meal and get it hot, so we would have a hot lunch rather than just eating a cold can of whatever you happen to have.
Not only a crew chief, but the chef.
Yes.
When you were a crew chief, how did you set up your whole area here? Because you had a bench, and then how would you set stuff up? About like where do you put your smoke, and where do you put your weapons and stuff?
Okay, these mounts right here, here, and here. There was a gun mount right here. Okay, and your 60 went on that. Okay, there was a small bench seat right here that we sat on with a safety belt. There's a curtain that goes on these. They have little pockets, and you put some smoke in there, and if you could do it and the pilots didn't catch you, you drop a couple of frags in there and maybe a Willie Pete, but you didn't let the pilots know you had it because they didn't like the idea of having white phosphorus grenades present. And usually right behind the gun right here, using these tie downs would be I had a big ammo box that was probably this wide and that tall, full of 7.62, but it was tied to the floor. It was secured to the floor with an old seat belt that had broken, and I used it to secure that with. And that's about it, really.
Was that when you ran slicks on the H models?
Yeah.
And okay, whenever your gun, your 60 would eject rounds, would you ever have to worry about the rounds coming out and working their way back to the tail rotor?
Oh yeah.
And stuff.
And occasionally you would get a strike occasionally. Usually it didn't hurt anything. It would just make a skin mark on the blade, but it wouldn't affect it. I did as far as knocking it out of balance or something like that, it never did anything like that. But yeah, occasionally you would get a piece of brass that would vibrate out and fly back, and it would ding the tail rotor.
Would you just carry 160 on the side?
Yeah.
But you'd have multiple barrels?
Yeah, I had several barrels.
How'd you change those out whenever it got too hot?
Spin the gun around inside. And there's a lever, you just go like this, pop that barrel out, pick this one up, slide it in, put that lever back down, spin it back around, and go to town.
That's it?
Yeah.
How many soldiers could you carry in here on a slick?
I used to put 2 in the center and 3 on each door. And that was my limit with my aircraft.
And you'd have them just sitting here on their butt with their legs out?
That's how they preferred it.
So they could jump off?
So yeah, so they could get off. Tell you an interesting story. We went out to recover some guys. They were out in the woods, and what they had done, I don't know where they got it, but they got a chainsaw from somewhere, and they literally cut a hole in the trees. The trees were 200, 300 foot tall. And they literally made a circle the width of the main rotor blades. And they took the logs, because the ground was real wet and soggy, they took the logs and made a pad out of the logs. So when you come in over the hole, and then you drop straight down, which required the gunner and the crew chief to watch the tail boom and the main rotor and tell the pilot if he's clear. So we come in and literally went straight down like an elevator, sat down on the logs, and then the guys jumped on. 2 in the center, 3 on each door, and I told the pilot, clear, let's go. Well, just as he picked up off of that pad, the guy that was sitting right there next to the bulkhead decided to jump off. Well, then that disturbed the balance. So the aircraft gently rocked. And when it did, the main rotor blade hit a tree. And we were committed, so I told the pilot, go, don't stop. So and we had to come straight back out like this, straight up like an elevator. But all the way up, we were chopping this tree, all the way up. Wood was flying everywhere. And all the guys in the ground, man, they all scattered like ants. You know, they thought it was going to crash. So they all scattered. I mean, like, whoosh, they were gone. And we made it out, and we made it back, and we dropped the guys off, but we had a vibration. So I told the pilot, shut it down to see what's going on. Well, what happened on the end of the blade, as I mentioned before, there's a metal piece where a hook goes to tie the main rotor blade down when you're not in service. Well, a piece of wood had wedged itself behind that plate and in front of the main rotor blade. And so I got my little toolbox out, took a big old Phillips screwdriver I had in there, and the 3 screws hold it on, took it off, cleaned the wood out, took the piece that was bent, took the piece over here to this floor, and I had a hammer in there, and I hit it about 4 good licks and made it flat again, took it over, screwed it back on, hit it a couple more licks, and screwed it all back on and told the pilot, okay, fire it up and see if we still got a vibration. And we didn't. I knew that would take care of it.
On your C model, on the C model gunship, where would your movable mount go that held your minigun? Where would that go on? Right about here.
Well, a different mounting configuration, totally different than this, and it would come out, and the minigun was out on the end, and it was hydraulically operated, and it was it was tied into the hydraulic system of the aircraft. So the minigun would flex. It would flex down almost 90 degrees. It would flex up 12 degrees, and it would flex in roughly 10 degrees. And there was a stop. So like if you started shooting on this side, and the co-pilot was the one that worked the minigun.
Right, with the handle.
He pulled his scope down out of the ceiling, and then wherever he moved the stick was where the minigun would go, whereas he was aiming. So if he started here, and let's say he was coming across, well, it had a stop on it, which would keep you from shooting yourself. But at the same time this one would stop, the one on the other side would pick it up and then carry it on through.
So you could do one big old long pass and come back around, and that gun would pick it up and it would go back and forth?
If you had your minigun set up for it. I had mine set, they would shoot 3,000 rounds in a 3-second burst. But I turned mine back because I didn't like burning the barrels up. And so I cut mine back to less than that so that it wouldn't burn the barrels up, because a minigun is nothing more than a motorized Gatling gun is all it is. Like the old West Gatling gun. Instead of cranking it, it's got a electric motor, and it shoots a flame about this long. Now, if you're out on a night mission and they use the minigun, you love it because you can get warm, because you're only sitting inches away from the flame, so you could warm up. But I never liked having to change my barrels out like as often as some guys had to do theirs, because they would burn them up. They would literally start glowing from the heat.
What about the rockets? What was it like being right here and having those rockets go off? Would you get like blown out with? No, it would go phew, we were out goofing off, really. We found a hooch out in the middle of nowhere, and so the pilots decided they were going to put a rocket in it. So the first guy comes around, he shoots his rocket, he misses. Well, my pilot
he kept going, and he kept going, and he kept going, and he kept going. And finally I stepped on the mic and I said, are you going to shoot the rocket, or do you want me to take it out and throw it? And just as I said that, he punched it off. Well, he broke to the right, which put me facing the explosion, and I got 10. The fins on the rocket are made out of a real thin, tinny material, and I got that stuff all the way down my leg. It went right through my flight suit, right into my leg.
From the explosion?
Yeah.
That's how close you were?
Yes, how close I was. And so I went to the flight surgeon, and he said, don't worry about it. You'll get these like little pimples on your leg. He said, just squeeze it and that metal piece will come out and it'll heal up. It just went in just under the skin, but there were some pilots that you had to be very careful shooting rockets and stuff, because they would get what they called target fixation. And they would stare at a target through the what's the word I'm looking for? Device to which they lined it up to shoot it through the scope, and they would get so fixed on it that they would lose their depth perception. And several times I had to wake them up, say, "Hey, are you going to shoot this thing, or what are we going to do?" You know, and because we'd be almost right on top of the target. And but they would do. You had to be careful with some pilots, because they would get that fixation going, and they would. You had to wake them up. Hey, come on, let's do something here. You know. One time we were out. We were actually on our way home. We had already done our day's thing. This is when I was in the Deltas, and
this is with the Copperheads.
Yeah, and there was like an oasis in the middle of a whole bunch of rice paddies, had palm trees and all this. And so the pilots, they were talking to one another. So they bet $20. He goes, "I bet I can put a rocket into that oasis over there from here." My pilot, "Yeah, you're on, $20. Give it a shot." So the first, boom, misses. So then my pilot, he turns the aircraft and boom, it went in there. And when it did, it was about a flame shot about 50 to 100 foot in the air. And so, hey, we better go look and see what this is all about. Went down there looking around, and there was 55-gallon drums all in there. It was a gas depot for the VC. And they were hiding these 55-gallon drums in this place. So we just backed off, and they just started pumping rockets in there, blowing those 55-gallon drums up. And it was quite a light show, you know. We destroyed all those drums that day.
So whenever you were with the Copperheads and you ran your gunships, tell me about where and how you hung your 60.
All right, a C model gunship, this wall comes out to here. So this is wall all the way across. Okay, we sat here, turned sideways in the seat, hooked a bungee cord up in there, and the bungee cord hung down, and then you hook your 60 to the bungee cord, and then you could move the 60 any way you wanted. You just grabbed it like this, and you just and again, we had these little covers on the walls with little pockets, and we would put stuff in there.
What would be your because you're on the gunship? What's your loadout for your weapons? You just had a 60 and like an M16, the old Mattel M16.
Yeah.
And you had a grenade launcher.
Sometimes I'd take an M79 with me and shoot it from time to time. We actually had one C model. They mounted a 50 caliber machine gun on it on the right hand side, and they only got to use it a few times because the vibration, the shock of a 50 caliber on these airframes shook all the rivets loose. So they had to take it off because of the airframe wouldn't withstand the vibration of the 50 caliber machine gun.
Did you guys ever put a stereo in here?
No.
Or a reel-to-reel or something?
No.
Nothing like that?
No apocalypse.
Okay, so I listened to a podcast the other day, and it was about this pilot, and and he's the AC of it. And on their way back at the end of the day, they would crack a beer, and they'd have an ice chest. None of that ever went on with you guys or anything like that?
No, we did that after we got home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, we never did anything like that. No. Probably when I was in the Deltas, the coolest thing, when I was in the Central Highlands my first year, I worked a lot with Green Berets. And because their A camps were along the Cambodian border. And I was in a slick, and we used to carry ammunition out to them and food or whatever. And I loved going into their A camps because they had the Mountain Yard people who are the indigenous equivalent to American Indians in Vietnam. They used to work with the Green Berets. And I loved going into their camps and stuff because the Mountain Yards would have all their families there. And it was pretty cool. It was a lot of fun. When I went to the Deltas, I got to work with SEALs. And the first time I ever saw a SEAL up close, we went in. They literally lived on boats in the river. Okay, and they had a barge that looked like Gold's Gym with every known barbell, dumbbell, whatever, and I would average height, okay, 5'9", 5'10", average height, and I walked around that place like this the whole time. I don't think there was a guy under 6 foot, and every one of them was built like Jesse Ventura, who was a SEAL. Every one of those guys were all muscular bound, and the Vietnam combat fatigue had big pockets right here. They cut them off just below that big pocket and made shorts out of them. And back then they had what they call the Zumwalt rule, which meant they could have beards, facial hair, and almost every one of them had some form of facial hair. And they were some big guys. So we took them out. They had us slicked, and they took, I think there was 6 or 8 of them. Took them out, and they turned them loose in this rice paddy, and they were going to online, and they were going to assault this village. And these guys moved like cats. I mean, we had a problem keeping up with them because we were flying in a circle for gun cover, but they were moving this way at the same time. So we were having to stretch out to keep up with them. Well, the CNC ship, the command control ship up above, we kept telling the pilots, how come you guys aren't shooting those guys in the open? How come you're not shooting them? And my pilot goes, because that's the guys. That's the Navy SEAL guys. They couldn't believe how quickly those guys moved. They were just moving so quickly, more so than anyone I'd ever seen. And they went through that village. Well, there was no one there. And when they came out the other side, if it wasn't locked down, nailed down, or whatever, they took it. They came out of there with all kinds of souvenirs, and took them back to their little base camp thing. But I was so impressed with those guys, how well they worked together as a team. 6 or 8 guys, how disciplined they were, and how well they worked together. And it was actually fun working with them the few times I got to work with them.
Was it fun riding home on this at the end of the day?
Absolutely.
And then having that relaxed, beer time's coming, and then get the get the aircraft parked and shut everything down for the day?
Rum and Coke, please, a double. That was the end of my day.
Just get them out.
Yeah, once you, for me, once it sat down, then my work really began, because I had to post inspected it. Even after the pilots inspected it, I went over it again, and then my day was done. Then I would go and shower and eat and have a drink, and then go to bed, usually, because you had to be back up again at 4:30, 5 o'clock the next day.
Did you ever get a day off?
When my aircraft was in the hangar, that would be my day off. Even though I had to go, there was things when it was in the hangar. There was things I had to go do that were my responsibility while it was in the hangar. But once I got those things done, then my time was my time. The only difference to that was like if we were short people. One time my ship was in the hangar and they were short gunners. So I actually flew as a gunner for one of the other crew chiefs because we didn't have enough people. But normally those were my days off when it was in the hangar.
When you were on the guns with the Copperheads, how many C model helicopters did you guys have in your group?
4.
4 of them?
Yeah.
And were they all 4 like on standby, so that if you had like a QRF or something come up and somebody needed something, everything was ready to go?
Yeah.
Yeah. How fast would it take from the time of being called where you guys could be in the air?
10, 15 minutes maybe, if maybe less.
Is that where they call it? I want to call it a cold start?
Hot start.
A hot start? Okay.
We were working with some Marvins, and they had actually got chased down off a hill by the NVA, and they had set up this little perimeter for the night, and we landed inside that perimeter, and the perimeter wire was like, the skid was here and the perimeter wire was there. And that night, both my pilots slept in the seats, and me and my gunner, we slept on the deck as best we could. Mosquitoes about eat us all up. But my blades were untied, and all the pilot had to do was pull the trigger to start it, to get out of there as fast as possible. Fortunately, nothing happened that night. You know, we stayed there until the next morning, and then they told us we could leave. But we were fortunate nothing happened that night. But we were prepared for a hot start and get out of there as quickly as possible.
How often would you have to stay at a FOB?
Hardly any at all. We always got to go home, you know. The only other occasion I spent the night away was when I was in Central Highlands. We had worked on the mountain range near the ocean, and there was a huge Air Force base right there called Phuket. And actually what it was, their runway was long, and what they were an emergency landing location for B-52s that were coming out of the north. If they got shot up or a missile got them or something, if they could get to Phuket, they had a place to land. And that's what it basically, they had other aircraft, they had fighter aircrafts like F-4s and stuff that flew out of there. But mainly it was there as a place for the B-52s to go in case of an emergency. Well, we had been flying that day on that side of the mountain. So at the end of the day, when we got turned loose, we were ready to go home. Well, a storm had moved in, and we couldn't get over the pass because the weather was too bad. So we went back to Phuket, and they're really nice guys. They took us in, and they took us down to their guys who do the rescue stuff for the Air Force, and they had their own little building, you know. And so of course they were curious about our gunships, and so we gave them a little tour and showed them everything. And so they took us in for dinner, and these guys were eating steak and baked potatoes. Okay, we're eating sea rations, or whatever we can get our hands on. And even in our mess hall, roast beef was, no, we used to call it roast buffalo, but roast beef was almost every night was roast beef. So these guys are eating steak and potatoes. So they fed us like kings, and they had a freezer full of ice cream. They had a popcorn machine, and they had an area where they showed first line movies. So we got popcorn and ice cream, and we went and watched the first line movie. And then for sleeping that night, we were used to sleeping on mattresses like this, you know, maybe three inches. Well, they had mattresses like this, you know, real honest mattresses. And I mean, it was like heaven that one night. You know, we got fed good, got to see a movie, and got a good night's rest. Got up the next day, cranked up, and flew home. So
all the little things that make it worth it. All right, is there anything else you want to tell us about this helicopter before we move on?
Well, the floor is porous. Okay, even though it's painted, it's porous. Mike, my friend, who lives in Fresno with me, he and his gunner at that time, I was still working in maintenance. They flew into Laos. Okay, not supposed to say that, because it took some Australian mercenaries. Their mercenaries, they had lost 2 or 3 guys over there, so they were going back to retrieve the bodies. So they went back and they retrieved the bodies. Now, you got to imagine, these bodies have been out in the heat for a week maybe, I don't know how long, and they didn't have body bags. So they just got them and tossed them inside the bird. Well, these bodies were leaking fluids. Well, the fluids penetrated this material, and it stunk bad. And Mike came to me and he goes, they had scrubbed it with everything under the sun they could find, and nothing would cut the stink. So finally I told him, I said, Mike, come over to the hangar, I'll give you some paint and brushes. I said, we'll go over and we'll paint your floor, and we'll paint that stink in. And so that's what we did. We painted the floor gray, just like this, but we put about 3 or 4 coats of paint on it until you couldn't smell that any longer.
Can you imagine flying in this thing and the whip going and the juices flying around? You'd be sticking your head out the side there, ready to jump off.
But yeah, that was a bad deal. It took a while before the stink finally subsided and went away. But after we put the paint on it, it really went away then. But
one last question: how fun was it to be sitting back here and being flying really low, like you see in the passes, running through the rivers with a whole bunch of Hueys like that, and being able to hang out and be able to? That must have been fun.
When you're 19 or 20 years old, that's fun. You don't realize how dangerous it is. You know, you're invincible. I was flying with a Puerto Rican pilot one day, Mr. Perez, and he goes, hey Chief, have you ever been to the tunnel? I said, no sir, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. He goes, here, let me show you the tunnel. So we went down dirt level, and what it was on this road, the trees had grown up on each side and then over the top, so it formed a tunnel. And the people had gone in and cleared it so that it was a tunnel. That's what it was, but it was trees. And he goes, you ever been down the tunnel? And I go, no. And he goes, here, let me show you. So we went in this thing, right? Imagine now, we're going in this tunnel of trees, and fortunately at that moment there was no one coming on this road. Well, about 3/4 of the way through this thing, and by the way, it was just wide enough for the main rotor blades. I mean, one bobble to the right or one bobble to the left, it'd have been all over. And so we're going down through this thing, and a guy in a Lambretta comes in the other end facing us. Now, Lambretta is like a Cushman, a little Cushman. And they usually have a seating area where it's basically a little taxi cab, 3-wheel taxi cab.
Is that the one where the guy sits in the front with the little,
yeah,
and then somebody's
People
in the
sits
back?
in the back,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
So he comes in this way. Okay, somebody's got to give, right? And on each side of the road, there's drainage ditches for the monsoon season. So we just keep going. And when we went by him, he was off in the ditch. His Lambretta was up on its side, and he was giving me the California howdy as we went buzzing by him. And we went out the other end, and boom, we got out of there and got gone. But yeah, we used to do a lot of things that a sane person would have never done, you know. And they were, you know, there was fun times. I'm so happy. I'll always thank my dad for the advice he gave me to be something more than an infantryman. And I'll say this right up front. My biggest heroes in the Vietnam War were the guys that wore the CIB, Combat Infantry Badge, because those were the guys that humped the hills and the mountains of the Central Highlands, who slept out in the woods at night, who received the food, the ammo and stuff that I brought them, and that was their life. And to me, those guys are the heroes. You know, we got to go back to a base camp every night. They didn't. They had to stay out in the woods, in the mountains. In the Central Highlands, it gets cold, but they had to endure and stay out there. You know, dig holes and live in a hole. To me, those guys, they're the heroes. They're the heroes of my time, and I have the utmost respect for infantrymen and what they went through.
Well, thanks for spending some time with us and telling us some of your stories about this. And thank you very much.
All right, son. Bye.